There's nothing wrong with trying to look good and remarkable, unless it's the only thing you think about. And if that's the case, you've got to readjust your priorities. You don't want to be all package and no present. This afternoon, I want to tell you a couple of differences between just a pretty dress and an artifact. What makes that distinction? So we're going to do that exercise with these two wedding dresses here, telling one happy story and one tragic story. The dresses are beautiful. There's no two ways about that. They're attractive, appealing, all the right things. But an artifact has a value beyond the obvious, and it's the stories associated with the artifact that really give it its impact. The first one I want to talk about is this dress here, which was worn as a wedding dress in Glasgow in Scotland in about 1908. And this is still the influence of Art Nouveau, as the popular applied art style of the period, which is basically all about curves. It's supposed to be a reflection of natural form, but this is built up with layers of underwear and a corset and all this sort of thing. So it accentuates the body, but in a way which is seen as dignified. It's supposed to be a mature look. The hips are large, the chest is large, but those exaggerations are really to make that waistline look as small as possible. That's equated with femininity and with youthfulness. So those are important issues. It is white. White is certainly associated with weddings now, and was in 1908. But it's also about objectification, because in a white dress you can't do much without getting it dirty. And especially if you're used to working on a farm, you don't wear white on a conventional basis. It's also a fragile fabric. These are all objectifying things. This proves that it's a special garment. There are meanings to this. The couple had two small daughters within the next 2 or 3 years. And in 1911, they decided to immigrate to Canada and start farming, which they did just outside of Winnipeg. In 1914, the First World War started, and the husband decided it was his responsibility, his duty, to join up with the Canadian military and go off to Europe to fight in the Great War. So he went off, she stayed at home, ran the farm by herself, looking after the two little girls. He was gassed with mustard gas 3 times in the battlefields and survived. But the last time he was listed as missing in action. And she got the telegram saying that he wasn't coming back, and she refused to accept that news. She just refused. She put the 2 daughters with the neighboring farm and went off to Britain and joined up with the Canadian Army as an entertainer. And she sang in the field hospitals and in the army camps on the continent, and she found him. He was so badly damaged, I guess he wasn't able to speak for himself, perhaps even identify himself. But she found him and brought him back to Canada. So a very, very positive experience. The other dress, though, is a little bit more somber. This was worn as a wedding dress in Winnipeg in 1930. Beautiful dress, pan velvet, 3 trains that hang as a unit down the back. They're a good 12, 14 feet long, all lined in pink ruffles. The dress is all hand-finished, beautifully made. The previous one, it's factory made, beautifully done, but it's still factory. This one was custom. It has, I don't know how many yards or meters of fabric in it, but perhaps as many as 20, maybe even more. The amount of labor that went into it. The trains, which appear to be unified, are in fact in 3 separate panels, are completely lined with layers and layers and layers of silk net ruffles. All the cut seams are finished by hand, and this is laborious, and especially if it's done in a proper couture house, which this was. Even the invisible sewing has to be done by a master sewer. It has to be done precisely because their standards are so high. You pay for that. The whole wedding event was obviously meant to be impressive. It was larger than life. It was someone's indulgence. I have a lot of money, I'm important, I want you to notice. It still retains the shaping of the 1920s in that it's up and down. The other dress is the Edwardian form. It's an hourglass kind of figure. This still has the influence of the tubular styles of the 1920s, but the change is happening. The Depression has come along, and what's happening is the body starts to re-emerge out of the understatement of 1920s dresses. So we have an indication of a waistline. The hips are fully displayed, just as they would be in a 20s, a real true 20s dress, but the skirt is full enough that it adds volume so that the waistline becomes more conspicuous. And what I find interesting is this whole yoke thing through here is transparent silk gauze, and it's pale pink. So presumably colored so that when she walked in, it appears like the dress is almost falling off. She has nothing up here. Now, if she had underwear on, the straps would show through there. So it's possible that she had an underdress that had similar pale pink straps to keep the slip in place, or nothing, because she was a modern and this was showing off. The following year after the wedding, the bride decided she was going to go on a shopping spree down to St. Paul's, Minneapolis, just directly south from Winnipeg. She couldn't get anyone to go with her. She was frustrated by that. So when she got to the border, she actually decided this wasn't going to be an enjoyable experience. So she turned around and went back to Winnipeg. And on her way home, she decided to drop by to see one of her 6 bridesmaids. It was, as I say, it was a very posh wedding. So she came to the door of the bridesmaid's house, and her own husband was there. And it had turned out he was having an affair with one of the bridesmaids. We tend to react as sort of a nervous kind of amusement about this, but it wasn't amusing. The bride went to her home and she committed suicide. And that's what makes you look at the dress in a different way. And you still take it superficially. You think, well, that was overreacting and so on. But if you think of the time in history where this event happened, in 1930, a divorce was much more important than it is now, and certainly much less commonplace. But it was also seen as a failure, not just in the wedding, but in the bride. The wife was not a good enough wife. She couldn't keep the affections and attention of her husband. He could drink, he could run around, he could beat her, and somehow she had a responsibility in those terrible things. So for her to simply be embarrassed wasn't enough. And in fact, she took her own life because she couldn't stand the embarrassment, the shame, and the disappointment. I recently did get her name, but I don't want to discuss it because I think the anonymity of her has its value, because then she represents all women of that time period and all women who had that kind of experience and the frustration and the disappointment and so on. She becomes symbolic rather than realistic. So I ask you, wedding dresses or artifacts? Simply a beautiful gown or a part of history?